Aaron,
Oops.
this is Jim Nairn. I'm the first vice president and chief operating officer over at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia and the Sunday Breakfast Club president. And I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thanks for jumping on the call this afternoon for this afternoon's program. Before I turn it over to Chris, I just wanted to do a couple of thank yous to our sponsors. If we can go to our sponsor slide. So, again, really thanks to all of our sponsors out there. Without their support, we just couldn't make this happen at the price that we do for club participants. We've got a list of the sponsors here today, but I wanted to call out a couple of sponsors. I wanted to try to do this time we meet. One of our sponsors is Liberty Business Strategies. I don't know if Emmy Miller, one of our club members, is on the call today. If you don't know them, they're great to know. They're even in our portfolio at the Federal Reserve as the part of the roster of consultants that we have available to do executive coaching. So if you get a chance to catch up with Emmy Miller at one of our future events, someone who's good to know. And of course, appropriate for tonight is WHYY, one of our neighbors here on the block over by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and appropriate for tonight's event. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you. Again, thank you everyone for coming, and we're looking forward to see you in person again in February. At the end of the program tonight, Chris will give you a quick update on what that looks like for February. So again, thanks to everyone for making it tonight.
Thanks very much, Jim, and welcome everybody. We're glad you could make it. We see people are still flowing in. A couple of notes about how we're going to do this on Zoom. Some of you may be out of practice. It may be a while since you run something on Zoom. We're gonna, if you have a question you'd like to ask Marty, please put it in the chat. I'll be looking at those throughout the evening and trying to weave them into the flow of the conversation rather than waiting for a Q&A at the end. Also, please mute yourself because otherwise we'll have tons of background noise drowning out the conversation with Marty. So now, Justin, if you could spotlight Marty, we can get going with the interview.
Should be good.
Don't think so. I'm still seeing everybody.
You're probably in gallery view. I've got Marty and Chris pinned at my end here.
Okay. Well, Marty, you're in Newtown, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining the Sunday Breakfast Club.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much for giving us your time.
Absolutely.
So we're going to spend a fair amount of time looking back over your long, wonderful, legendary career at WHYY with Radio Times. But I wanted to start by looking forward just briefly, because the sad news that Radio Times was to be no more contained a little nugget of hope in that there is another show that you're planning to launch fairly soon. So could you tell us a little bit about the connection?
Sure. And it is called The Connection with Marty Moss-Coane. And I was done with Radio Times, which we will talk about. I was not done with radio. So HYY very generously said, if you have a show and you want to do it, we're behind it. So what a wonderful gift to me. And I was thinking the last couple of years how the pandemic has just driven us apart, how our politics has driven us apart, how social media brings us together and then distracts us and drives us apart, and trying to think of a show where we make connections, where we figure out what matters to us, what matters to other people, what do we have in common, how to live in a sort of almost trite way, how to live a life of meaning and purpose. And I think of connection as part of human survival. We used to talk about the survival of the fittest, and the new thinking is it's really the survival of the nicest. I mean, we wouldn't have survived as a species if we were just fighting with each other all the time. and also the importance of connection for just human well-being. So it allows me to talk to anybody and everybody under the sun with this sort of larger idea of the fact that we are all connected and we all struggle with our connections, and how to move forward and better understand ourselves and each other.
It'll be once a week for an hour, is that right?
Once a week for an hour, same kind of format. It's what I think I do best, which is long conversations that are live. I enjoy that. And we don't have an exact date, but I'm aiming for the last Friday in January. So in a couple of weeks, but we're working on all the little details to get it up and running.
Okay, thanks, Marty. So let's look back a bit, and I want everyone to cast their minds back to 1987, if you were alive then. If not, I'll tell you a little bit about what was going on then. Ronald Reagan was president, and one of the things he did that year was tell his counterpart in Russia, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. In that year, The Simpsons aired on TV for the first time. In the Middle East, the first intifada began. Inflation clocked in at a low 1.9%, but the stock market crashed anyhow. In one day, the Dow lost a whopping 508 points, which was 1/5 of its value back in 1987. Platoon won the Oscar for Best Picture. The Phillies, Eagles, and Sixers all stunk, but the Flyers made it to Stanley Cup Finals, which, of course, they lost. And at WHYY, a young unknown sat down to start a radio show that nobody was quite sure what it would be or how long it would last. And 35 years later, here we are, Marty, at the end of one of the most fabulous runs that public radio has ever known. You became part of the morning routine for thousands and thousands of people around this region. You helped make us all smarter. You helped explain the world to us. And you gave us a respite from the increasing polarization and division by being an oasis for civil and intelligent dialogue. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that.
So tell us a bit about the wandering path that brought you to there at the old WHYY 35 years ago.
Yeah, where does one start? Gosh, there was a joke when I was in sort of just out of college that Marty was going to have a shopping center because she couldn't make up her mind, what career to have. So my careers have ranged from a macrobiotic vegetarian cook, a school counselor, a case manager. I sold furniture. I was a waitress. I made terrariums and sort of wandered around the Philadelphia area trying to find myself. But it literally was a discovery of public radio and a discovery of Susan Stamberg, and who was the first woman to anchor a national news program, All Things Considered. And when I heard her, I just heard I heard a human being on the air that was not airbrushed and laughed and was curious. And I just thought, I want to explore what public radio is all about. And so that was kind of my door into the studio.
Mm-hmm. And what was your first job there?
My first job, I started as a lowly volunteer intern. I worked in the news department in the newsroom. Back then you could smoke, and we had razor blades where we cut tape. Mumia Abu Jamal was our star reporter at the time, which is interesting to think about. And I was a really, really bad reporter. It's not in my psychology to go out and get 3 hours of tape and then winnow it down to 3.5 minutes. It was just beyond my capabilities, but I could take something really little and make it an hour. And so clearly I wasn't going to be able to be a reporter there, but there was a wonderful station manager named Bill Siemering, and he and I hooked up, and I came up with a psychology show that was originally called Family Matters, and then Voices in the Family with Dan Gottlieb. And I, learned a lot about being on the air by being a producer, watching Dan, learning from both of our mistakes, and then realized that what I really wanted to do was be on the air. I worked up with Fresh Air when it was a local program, editing tapes, listening to Terry in my headphones. And then Danny and Terry let me fill in hosting for her from time to time. And Radio Times was launched out of that.
Right. I just want to start underlining the one name you mentioned, Bill Simmering, who's really one of the giants of public radio, started years ago, Fresh Air, All Things Considered, just an amazing pioneer.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the most humble man I know on top of that.
So whose idea was Radio Times, and what was the idea? And did it really resemble what Radio Times did?
Well, 35 years ago, you could do things without having a game plan or I'm putting together all these things for this new show that I'm doing. I did none of that for Radio Times. To be honest with you, Bill basically said, let's do a radio show. And I said, sure. And we did. And we just made it up as we went along. So I think my original plan was to survive on the air. I do remember doing that very first show. I don't remember the topic, but I remember getting through it. Probably wasn't very good. And then realizing, oh my gosh, I have to do this again the next day. And then I have to do this again the day after that. So learning the sort of rhythm of how to prepare for a show like that. But then what do you want to talk about? So it was always a show about everything.
Mm-hmm. And
excuse me.
I want to give people a sense of how unusual it was what you did for 35 years. 2 hours of live radio with multiple guests plus call-ins on multiple topics.
Right.
What did it take in terms of you and your team to pull that off for many years for 10 hours a week?
Yeah. I know. I used to remind them that we do 500 live original shows every year, which was kind of daunting. I mean, on my part, it took a lot of homework.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally just a lot of time reading books and reading articles and thinking about what it is that who do we want to talk to and why do we want to talk to them or what should we talk about? In many ways, that's what producers do, which is to not just come up with ideas, but also to be able to vet guests and figure out, what's the sort of most interesting topic and who's the best person to talk about it. So it was I will say, became a very well-oiled machine where we knew how to get this stuff done and put it on the air. But it's a lot of work. There's no question about that.
Yeah, let me tell a little tale from personal experience. I had the honor of filling in for you from time to time. And I would go back to your producers and I would say, well, what do you got to prep me for this interview, this show? And they would give me a folder that was about the size of the Manhattan phone book. And I'd say, I don't have time to read all this. And I'd start reading it and I'd go back to them and say, can't you winnow it down for me? And they'd say, Marty does not want us to winnow. She wants everything. She doesn't want to miss a single piece. You really did an enormous amount of research for these shows.
Yeah, I did. And to be honest with you, I learned to really enjoy it. I've sort of told a joke, and it's mostly true, that I was not a great student in high school, certainly. And I used to not do my homework. And so sometimes I thought of this as my punishment for not doing homework. But on the other hand, I learned so much and learned to enjoy learning so much. And then, of course, being able to talk to really fascinating people about their life or their life's work.
Mm-hmm. And what was your method for interviewing? You made it sound effortless, hour after hour, week after week, but did you write down a bunch of questions or were you winging it during the interview? Or
no, I always wrote down 25 to 30 questions. And I often would start with, why am I talking to this person? Just without reading a lot of stuff or getting my brain contaminated with other people's ideas. It's like, why do I want to talk to them? And then I would sort of build from there, from the research and things that would strike me. And I've always felt that there's the interview that you prepare for, and then you go in knowing I have a plan, I have a game plan. And then that allows you to relax and to listen, and then to hear the interview that you didn't prepare for, but the one that's actually happening on the air, and then having the wherewithal to sort of go with the conversation, bringing it back when it felt like the right thing to do, or just going off on a tangent. But the preparation allowed me to to relax and to be spontaneous and to be almost improvisational.
Mhm. And who were some of your favorite interviews? People who you were happy to bring back again and again because they always delivered, or you always enjoyed talking to them?
Oh gosh, I mean, so many of them. It's funny. I've been asked this, as you can imagine, the last couple of months, and surprisingly, one of the people that I interviewed, I think 8 times, was Salman Rushdie.
Hmm.
As we know, was, viciously attacked this past summer, horribly injured. And we did a show about him with some people that knew him. And when I went back to the research, I realized I interviewed him on 7 books. And I have to say, I didn't always understand his books. I didn't always connect with them, but he was such a lovely man and such a wonderful conversationalist. And you just sort of felt, again, that he was someone you could go in a million different directions, and wherever you went, it would be interesting. And of course, he's had a fascinating life. He had fascinating friends, but he was someone that kind of surprised me. I kept going back to. There was one day we had as a double header, Madeleine Albright and Toni Morrison, back-to-back guests. That was pretty cool. We were talking about Wilt Chamberlain, actually, who was that was 30 years ago or so. He was a guest on Radio Time, in person on Radio Times as well. So it's a long list.
And that was after his book where he said he slept with, I don't know, what was it, 10,000 women? So what was your opening line there?
Oh, well, 20, he said 20,000 women. And we got to that. I didn't lead with that. I sort of felt like, let's bury that. And we got to that in the interview. And I said, well, Wilt Chamberlain, you have the whole, excuse me, you have the whole country doing long division, which got a laugh out of him. So that was good.
So back to Salman Rushdie, your preference, I know, was always to have your guests in studio. Did you have Salman Rushdie in studio?
Mm-hmm.
So were there any security concerns or anything more that you sort of had to take care of when?
No, the first time he was on, and I don't remember, it was one of his novels. It was not the one that got him in trouble, but he was still under a fatwa, as I recall, sitting out reading the New York Times in our lobby. Just, like any other guest who was arriving there. He never asked for security. He never act like he was a man with a death threat over his head, at least, in our building. But I know he did have to take very serious precautions, obviously.
And what is the magic, the trick to getting the big names to come on a radio show, local radio show in some senses?
Yeah. Well, I like to think, sometimes it's not like we got everybody that we wanted, but I often felt between the producers and myself that if we could get them in the studio the first time, they would probably want to come back. Just because the producers were always so professional and welcoming. And I think the guests always felt that they were in good hands. And it was clear I had done my homework and I had a game plan. They weren't going to be left to interview themselves. That often happens when people are on things like book tours, like no one reads the books.
Right.
So, it's kind of nice when someone actually does read your book for an interview. And so people will come back for more. Because Oliver Sacks was another one who I interviewed him on a bunch of his books, and
And you did read the book, right?
I did. I didn't read every word on every page, but I spent 2 or 3 hours reading a book.
The long train ride back to Bucks County, I guess, was a boom. You did a lot of reading on the train.
I did.
Okay, so those were some of the memorable good interviews. What about bad ones? What about people where it just went haywire?
Yeah.
And I know one was Carl Bernstein.
It was. And I think everyone has a Carl Bernstein story, but I was thrilled that he was coming to Philadelphia. I think he was speaking at the Free Library of Philadelphia. We used to often piggyback on their guests that they brought to town. And this was, I think, 2008. And he'd written a book about Hillary Clinton that had gotten really nice reviews, and he was going to be in town. And I thought, well, who wouldn't want to interview Carl Bernstein about Hillary Clinton? And that morning that he arrived, he had gotten a really nice review in the New York Times. Great. Susan Greenbaum, who was one of my producers, went out to greet him, and he said, "Tell Marty that I got a really good review in the New York Times and I would like her to quote from it." And she said, "Don't worry, she's got a game plan. You're fine. She read your book. She loved it, blah, blah, blah." Well, he kept pestering me as I walked him down the hall saying, "I want you to read as a demand. I want you to read this a sentence or two from this book review." And I said, "I have a game plan. We're good, good, good." And then he just kept going and going. And finally I said, I don't tell you how to write your books. You don't tell me how to do my radio show. And we kind of bickered through the hour. And then when the interview was over, it did last an hour. It was a long one. He did say, "You're a terrible interviewer." And I said, "You're a terrible guest." And he was. He was terrible.
Was that on air or was that afterwards?
That was afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was clear that there's something seriously wrong going on the air.
So was Carl Bernstein never invited back to radio?
No. And it's too bad because, he's Carl Bernstein. It would have been fun to have fun with him. But
so it is, I want to underline, a live show. So that
Yes.
if you got an interviewee who's a turkey and you've allocated a certain amount of time, what were your tricks to like making it through those 20 minutes of those hours where the person was just not delivering?
yeah, it's funny. I was remembering we had Al Green booked to come on the show, and he was 53 minutes late for a 57-minute interview. So that's when producers come in and they were scrambling all over the place trying to put together people that could talk about Al Green. Was not a particularly good show. I mean, to be honest with you, that's when callers can save a show.
Mhm.
When it's clear that things are going terribly wrong with the guests, and it didn't happen that often. Then you can turn to the callers and start a conversation with them or get them somehow involved in the conversation. It didn't, frankly, it didn't always work. Sometimes it was just painfully obvious that things are not going well on Radio Times.
So you and the callers, that's kind of a complicated relationship, right?
It is. It
You
is.
I love them, but sometimes they just
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I love them. And it meant, there were times when callers added something to the show that just made it magic. And those moments were wonderful and worth it. Oftentimes, callers just wanted to talk about themselves and, trying to figure out how to shape what they wanted to say to the conversation. I had crank callers. That kind of comes with the business as well. Baba Booey, Howard Stern, people calling in. That stuff happens as well. And over time, I have to say, I've sort of lost that magical feeling that I used to have with callers when the lines all light up and you get really excited. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of people's phone calling habits have changed because now you can text.
Mhm.
And so in the last couple of years, I would say we had many more people that would email us or leave us comments on Facebook or tweet at us or text us with their comments rather than waiting 25 minutes on the phone to have their 2 minutes of airtime.
Yeah, Marty, as you know, our theme for our programming this year is Philadelphia Rising. So I want to talk about you and your perceptions of Philly a bit. But first off, in that notion of Philadelphia Rising, as you look back, who were some of the most inspiring Philadelphians who you got a chance to meet and interview, people whose stories or accomplishments kind of stuck with you?
Yeah. And, I knew you were going to ask me that, Chris, and I wanted to answer that as honestly as I could. And there are many, many people that certainly inspired me, but I thought of 4 that really stood out. I wrote them down just so I wouldn't forget. Dorothy Spite Johnson, whose son was murdered many years ago, started this organization called Mothers in Charge, helping other mothers who had lost their children and providing education and grief counseling. And we had her on, sadly, untold numbers of times because of the level of violence, both in the city, but also around the country. But she was someone that whose life really moved me very deeply. Jennifer Childs, co-founder of 1812 Productions, very different a Philadelphian who created this theater comedy group that does these really wonderful original performances a couple of times a year. She has this great character that she plays called Patsy, who sits on her stoop in South Philly. And a couple of years ago, I had her put it into a performance, some of my hate mail. So there's a 8-minute, it's on YouTube. It's very funny, 8-minute piece of her and a couple of other actors doing a performance of my hate mail. Mariana Chilton, who's the founder of the Center for Hunger-Free Communities and Witness to Hunger. She's at Drexel University and just the most passionate advocate for, we call it food insecurity, but it is essentially hunger. But she, again, was a guest I had on. And what I liked about her is she always put the women that she worked with from the community first. She put them forward and put herself second. And then the last one I was thinking of is Imani Perry, who's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. I interviewed her again on a bunch of her different books. She always had things to say about race that I had never thought of and just always stayed with me. And her most recent book, South to America, just won the National Book Award for nonfiction. So those were 4 people that I was really have been honored to interview, all of them a bunch of times.
Okay, great. I just want to say, particularly since a number of people have shown up since we started, if you have a question for Marty, please write it in the chat. Try to work it into the conversation as we go along. So feel free to put as many questions as you like into the chat. So Marty, your tenure, I counted up this morning, spans 7 United States presidents, 6 governors of Pennsylvania, and 5 mayors of Philadelphia. I imagine at least all the governors and mayors sat in the chair, so to speak,
Yes.
for times. I don't know how many of the presidents did.
Only
But any memorable moments with all those politicians?
Well, I do. I do remember with Ed Rendell, who I really, loved talking to, but he was in a particularly foul mood one morning, and he stood in my doorway. Excuse my language here, and he yelled about 2 minutes before airtime, "What the fuck am I doing here?" And I said, "You're here for an interview, Mr. I think he was Mr. Mayor at the time."
Mm-hmm.
I did yeah, I would say most of the governors we had on as well. I mean, certainly Rendell was the most colorful, I would say, of the bunch. Not my favorite thing to interview politicians. Just you have to sort of get beyond the script, I would say, especially if they're running for office. That's particularly boring.
So let's talk just a little bit about Philadelphia. You've been around this city for a long time through a number of different phases, up and down. What is your sense of how Philadelphia's evolved over the years, either for the good or for the bad?
Yeah, well, I started living in Philly in 1969, left for a year, then came back, and then have lived in and around the city ever since then. And I have to say, back in the day, it was a pretty boring, drab place that, when night fell and everyone sort of went home, there wasn't a lot, as I recall, there wasn't a lot of activity or culture besides the Philly Orchestra and the Art Museum. Nothing wrong with that, but it had a kind of old drab feeling to it. And I'm thinking that almost the biggest shift is, I remember doing shows about all the college kids that would come to the area and then they would graduate and leave. So the question was, how do we keep them here? And I do think that whatever the influx is, I don't know what the numbers are, but I think this influx of young people bringing their young ideas and their energy and their desire to eat in good restaurants and go to funky theater has helped to revitalize, some of the city, obviously not all of the city. To me, that's almost the most, and biking, that's sort of a young person's activity. I see that as a pretty dramatic change. Obviously, things that haven't changed are the poverty, still the poorest large city in the country. And then, of course, all the problems that come with that and the struggle with schools and all that. I mean, stuff everyone knows, sadly.
How did you think about and how did you work through the balance of topics from international, national to local, cultural to political. Did you have a formula, or were you more a matter of feel, or?
It was probably a matter of feel and opportunity and whatever, not whatever, but something in the news that said we need to do something about, I'll say, gun violence in West Philadelphia. I mean, that sadly was something we did a lot. But if there was, September 11th, we certainly did lots of shows about that because of the sort of horror of that day, but the importance of being able to talk about it and make sense of it.
Here's a question in the chat from Annie McGurk Molina, and I think it kind of fits where we just were. Based on your interviews and your vast expertise and experience, what are the top solutions or innovations you wish you could just wave a magic wand and make happen?
Oh, Lordy. Would that I could. I mean, it probably is poverty. If we could end poverty and all the things that come with it, the psychological things, the social things, the criminal justice things, the educational things. I mean, that would solve a lot of our problems. I remember doing something on the Universal Basic Income, UBI. It's kind of an interesting idea, which is give people enough money to be able to support themselves rather than a kind of hand-to-mouth existence. Maybe you can make a difference in the quality of their life. But I guess if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that.
Going back to the callers for a minute, we have a question from Lou Perdulo. I actually think this is something you and I might have talked about at one time, but did you ever think of having plants among the callers, like people you'd basically prep to have a good question or a good comment to call in?
I know that does feel like cheating. I mean, as tempting as that would be, no, I did not. I mean, in part because I like the spontaneity of and us. I like being in charge, but also not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So. No plans.
Okay, so if you go back again, if we cast our minds back to 1987, looking in the media landscape, Fox News is 1 year old. CNN is still Ted Turner's plaything. Not only do TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat not exist, Google has not started out as a company yet. So you've seen these enormous changes in terms of digital and social media over 35 years. So sort of a two-part question. How did it change what you did? And then how did it also impact, how do you feel that it's impacted the overall environment, both media and political in the country, for good or for worse?
Yeah.
First for you in Radio Times.
Yeah, I mean, it changed everything. This is back in 1987, 88, 89. I would send interns to the Free Library of Philadelphia with a bunch of dimes so they could go down into the basement there and, look up articles. I think it was called microfiche or something. I forget, but you would like slide a slide and then you'd find it. And then I guess you'd take a picture or copy it. So I used to send them over there and then they'd come back 4 hours later, 5 hours later, give me my little pile of things to study for the next day's show. So that is a really clunky way to do a show that wants to be topical. So social media obviously changed all of that in that, I don't need to tell anybody here. We're all just connected, online. So that's a wonderful thing. And it allows us to connect to the entire world, but it also meant the pace of deciding on shows and all of a sudden at 4 PM, oh my God, there's something else that's going on and we need to do that instead. So it has led, I think, to a certain level of stress and anxiety of just trying to, if you want to be topical, how do you stay up with everything when you feel like it's just, you're getting inundated with ideas and topics and opinions, left and right. And then it's, a lot of that is also very angry, and it's also led to a lot of conspiracy theories and, made it sometimes harder to get to what's the truth, what are the facts. So it's a mixed blessing, I would say. I mean, I couldn't live without it, but you have to be careful.
Are you an optimist or a pessimist about the future of this republic of ours?
Depends what day you catch me on. I'm a realist, I think, in that, I was born in 1949, so I don't, not that as a little kid I had any understanding of the world that we live in, but I've seen a lot. I've seen the civil rights movement. I've seen presidents get assassinated. Yeah. Martin Luther King be assassinated. So I feel Vietnam War, it's a long list that us boomers have lived through. So, and I see what's going on today, and it just feels like, why haven't we not evolved any further than what we have? So on the one hand, it feels familiar. On the other hand, we have gay marriage. We have a lot of, I would say, things that back in the 50s were unthought of, no one could think of, would be possible. So I see progress, but I see things that are holding us back as well.
Talking about your start at WHYY and the genesis of Radio Times, somewhat you said sort of captured the magic of that time in public media when it was a new thing, and there were giants roaming the landscape: Susan Stamberg, Bill Simmering, Terry Gross.
Yeah.
As you wind down a bit, not that you're leaving completely, but do you feel that public media still has a point? Do they have a niche, or have they been overwhelmed by the age of streaming services and 1,000 channels?
Yeah. It's interesting. The sort of mantra, I think it's still the mantra of NPR, is stand with the facts, which I think is a nice shorthand. I'm not sure it solves all our problems, but nonetheless, I think it's important to believe in facts. NPR has something like 25 million people that listen, so they have to be doing something right. And I think there's probably more opinion on NPR than there was back in the day, although back in the day, there was some pretty wild stuff that was happening on public media as well. So,
Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle to stay relevant, but also to keep true to your principles. And there have to be some principles in journalism about, what is true and what is not true, and how do we tell a story that is close to the facts and has some honesty and realness to it.
In the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd and the other things that happened were a shock to multiple systems, including public media. How did you see public media react to that and evolve and change?
Well, I know how we reacted to it. We meaning Radio Times. I mean, in certain ways, I feel like while I'm part of this larger system, I don't really know it very well, to be honest with you. I was too busy working on my own show, but obviously something as important and cataclysmic as that required a lot of, at least for us, a lot of really deep and painful conversations about race and police violence and, connection, the show that I'm working on now. And I think NPR, it's hard not to have felt that way. And there were so many opportunities afforded out of this tragedy to be able to talk about stuff, I think, in a new light, because, frankly, white people got to see what Black people knew and had been telling us was going on. And we got to see it in our own, with our own eyes. And hopefully that changed people's perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what we were going for.
Right. A question from Jeff DeMasi that connects back to what we were talking about a couple minutes ago. If Marty Moss-Coane was that 20-something intern making her way into audio now, would you still have gone to radio, or would you have just started your own podcast or something else?
Or something else, like the rest of the entire planet and their podcasts. I mean, maybe because I've been doing radio for so long, I do think of myself as a radio person. I mean, I think more and more we say the word audio because a lot of people don't know what a radio is anymore. So I like the spoken voice. I'll put it that way. That maybe reveals sort of my connection to what I do, because I like seeing people, but sometimes it's wonderful just to hear a voice and hear the pauses and the intonations and the conversation back and forth. So I'm a voice person more than probably a visual person.
Are there podcasts that you really like, or are there podcasts that you listen and go, what's all the buzz?
I mean, I don't have any go-to podcasts. I have a whole bunch in my queue I just listened to Rachel Maddow's Ultra.
Mhm.
Highly recommend that. Especially if you're interested in insurrections in American history that goes back to the 1930s and 40s. Is fascinating. But that was a good one.
So again, just sort of underlying just how much work it was to do 10 hours of live radio a week. That didn't leave you too much time, free time for hobbies, etc. So now that you're a partial lady of leisure, what do you think you'll be doing?
Well, I mean, I have to say that while, it was a lot of work, I also learned to be extremely organized. And, I have a family, so I made sure that it wasn't like, well, mommy's in her room and she can't talk to you now. I didn't believe in that. So I learned to sort of make work for me. And I have to say, and I always saved room for things that I love to do. I love to be outside. I'm a tennis. We never played tennis, Chris, but I'm a pretty good tennis player.
Right. Yeah.
I should be. I've played, it seems like my whole life.
That's because I'm afraid you would have kicked one.
I just signed up for an improvisational acting class because it interests me. And I was a chef in a vegetarian restaurant, so I'm a pretty good cook. I like to cook for people.
Well, gardening is big for you
And
too.
gardening, I like to be outside digging, and I have like a third of an acre here, and it's my little terra.
You probably know this, but from hanging around, in the Radio Times area of WHRY, I know your producers, if you were feeling a little down or a little worn out, they would book a gardening show because they would perk you up.
Well, it was funny. We had a guest that canceled, like 5 minutes, or there was some problem 5 minutes before airtime. And yes, we did a gardening show because they knew I need no prep.
Right, exactly. So I'm just looking to see, do we have any other questions? We have a little bit of time. So if somebody wants to just jump in and ask a question, if you don't want to put it in the chat, that would be fine.
I will ask, since you had such a broad following, did you find it challenging to have too much of a Philly emphasis? How'd that play in Pittsburgh, for example, or other places where they would pick up the NPR?
Well, we were a local show. This is Radio Times, obviously. So while you could listen to us in Pittsburgh, it was clearly a show that was created here in Philadelphia. We were carried on NPR's Sirius channel. So they carried a number of local shows on their channel. So we were carried in other cities, but we did what made sense to us locally. And if people in Pittsburgh wanted to listen, that was fine. But as far as we were concerned, we did a lot of local stuff, but frankly, we did a lot of national stuff, international. We had writers, people on book tours. So there was a lot of stuff that was not specific to Philly that we would talk about. But when the Eagles were winning, that was kind of fun, right, to talk about.
Right, and when you were on satellite radio, you picked up a certain fan base among truck drivers, right?
People did. I love that. Yeah. I mean, truckers, I guess, listen to a lot of satellite radio, and there was one or two guys. That would be like in Montana or something on their CB. I don't know how you do that in your truck, but nonetheless, we had some great truck drivers. It was fun.
One question that we had talked about that I neglected to ask: were there topics over the years that you felt duty bound, to jump on the news and do a show about, but there's a part of you just going, oh God,
Yeah.
not another hour on this one.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. I mean, I think the most obvious one is Donald Trump. I'll just say it. In that, I remember the first, when he came down the golden escalator in 2015, and the first person we booked actually was David K. Johnston, who used to write for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was their Atlantic City bureau chief. And he was probably the person in the country that knew more about Donald Trump as a businessman than anybody. And that was fascinating. And I would say the first couple of years, while we were trying to figure out this guy and what made him tick and what he was doing to the country. But over time, you just felt like, what more can be said? And I hear journalists today kind of struggling with how to talk about him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, abortion was always hard because, if you try to do the two sides, can you get a middle ground? Can you get something that people that really disagree vehemently, can you get them to come together on something? That rarely ever worked. The Middle East, trying to get Palestinians and Israelis to somehow come together. I mean, I don't think it was my job, but nonetheless, it was an effort. If something was going on that seemed important to talk about, you try to find the right people. But I would say the sort of typical topics that seem to lead nowhere.
Right, the intractable ones.
Yeah.
Lori Jones asks an interesting question. I'm curious if there's anything you would do differently in terms of how the show evolved, and how did you evolve the show over the decades?
Yeah. Would I do anything differently? I don't know that I would. Interestingly. I mean, the show did evolve over the years. I frankly think it got better, from that first day when all I wanted to do was just to make it to 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, whatever it was. I think I became a better interviewer in those contentious topics and those programs when you really did have to play traffic cop and beat cop to get people to behave. And I think early on I kind of let people railroad me a little bit too much, and I learned not to do that. I mean, it's no fun, and it's kind of embarrassing on the air.
Right. Sort of to that point, Jim Nairn asked, what was your biggest on-air surprise?
Oh, gosh. So many. I mean, that's sort of what makes a live interview fun, because you get surprised. Things happen that you did not expect. I have to think that over, just to give you an honest answer. I have to think about that.
Okay, well, let me know when you come up.
Yeah, I will.
I'll let Jim
I
know.
would have that at my fingertips.
And this question from Laura Zara connects to what you just said. How did you refine your skills as an interviewer over time? You mentioned one way, and she's interested to know, did you listen to your own shows?
Yeah.
And what kind of coaching was available for this rare thing that you do?
No, I listened to my own shows. I mean, I had supervisors, Bill Siemering being one, but others that would give me honest feedback. Frankly, my husband always gave me honest feedback. I mean, it's nice to have your biggest fan, but also your most honest critic, and it's actually a wonderful combination. But I listen to myself. I'm a harsh self-critic, so. And I would know if like an interview just didn't go the way it should have gone, or I wanted it to go. And I would listen to it, and I would be self-critical, and I would, try to figure out where it went wrong and how not to do whatever I did again. I do remember, listeners send in advice, of course. And someone once sent in and said that I needed serious speech therapy. So.
Are there interviewers who you really admire, who you learn things from? And I guess being devilish, I'd ask, are there any interviewers who are sometimes highly praised, do you think actually aren't that good at it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you have to say Terry Gross, and I have to say it because it's true. You know, she's a terrific interviewer. People that everyone praises that, again, you know, drawing a blank here.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I was fishing for Charlie Rose there, but
Oh yeah, I was not a big watcher of his show. There was something kind of off-putting about him anyway, but I mean,
and now we know so much more.
I know. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Other people, in terms of the positive people you think are really good interviewers?
There are interviewers on other NPR shows that have shows like Radio Times, Brian Lair in New York. There's a woman I actually co-hosted a show with, whose name, of course, I forget, who's at KQED out in San Francisco, is a really good interviewer. There are actually a lot of really good interviewers out there. I marvel. I think people have upped their game, which is nice.
Okay, here's a question in the chat from some guy named Dave Davies. I don't know if you've ever heard.
Dave, I missed you.
A while back, WHYY canceled The Why, which was an extended take on a local issue 4 times a week. Now we've lost Radio Times. Do you think WHYY needs to or will start a news show that has extended conversations or local news coverage?
Thank you, Dave, for the question. Yes, they need to. To be perfectly honest, I was surprised that, because I gave them almost a year's notice that I was ending Radio Times, that there wasn't, you know, someone waiting in the wings to kind of do their own version. Obviously wouldn't be called Radio Times, but to kind of carry on these local live conversations. So yes, there needs to be. There is, without, I don't have a lot of details, but there's some work going on behind the scenes to create something that will be locally produced. It's not ready next couple of months, but yeah, I mean, I think we gave up a lot of real estate that should have been ours.
Question from Shelley at the Pennsylvania Ballet. Sort of flipping it around, what advice would you give people who are being interviewed? Can you be a better interview and not embarrass yourself?
Yeah. Well, listen. Well, I would say the first one is pick an interviewer that you know will do their homework. You know, that will do their part of the job. I would say listen to what's being asked. Oftentimes people are so sort of scripted, or maybe they're so nervous, you know, that they just don't hear what's going on. Because when an interview is cooking, it's a conversation. And that's what makes it really fun for the listeners, when you feel like a conversation is going. I mean, be yourself, have some stories. I mean, you know, here's several things I didn't have an answer for. So you're not going to be able to come up with brilliant answers for everything. But, you know, in a sense, do your homework about if it's the ballet, you know, maybe there's a performance coming up, and maybe it's a Balanchine. And so you might want to have some Balanchine stories or something like that to make it interesting to listen to.
That was one of the values of you having the guest in the studio, because you were very good at subtly and politely indicating that it was time for them to stop talking. You know.
Yeah.
I had that experience with you a few times. You were very good at it.
Well, you wait for that. I learned that you wait for that pause when someone takes a breath, and then you can just jump in. So same with listeners.
All right. Okay. Here's a question from Joanne Fisher. It's like one social worker to another. I've always attributed your social work to your ability to connect so easily with others. How do you see social work influencing your radio career?
Oh gosh, in so many ways. I was a school counselor in Philadelphia for 3 years at 2 elementary schools. And then after that, that was a government Title I program that ran out of money. And then after that, I was a case manager up in a mental health center up in Kensington, North Philly, just below Episcopal Hospital there. And, you know, that was talking to people, talking to kids, talking to teachers, talking to families when I was a school counselor. And then as a case manager, it was lots and lots of home visits and troubleshooting and problem solving and, you know, trying to get people to connect and help, frankly, try to solve a lot of problems. But yeah, essential.
So Marty, one of the things you taught me over the years was the importance of hitting the post and getting to the break on time.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the clock, and we've forced you to talk nonstop for an hour. So I want to say thank you for tonight and for joining the Sunday Breakfast Club for this evening. But most of all, thank you for 35 extraordinary years of service to this community and listeners all over the country. So,
Well, coming from you, Chris, I really appreciate that.
and best of luck with the connection. We'll be looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
So I wonder if my colleague Justin could put our final slide up and let you know about our next Zoom event in January. So we're going to have one more bonus January Zoom event on the 18th, 2 weeks from tonight at 7 p.m., not at 4:30. Our guest will be David Boyer. He's politics editor at the Washington Times. He was a columnist with the Philadelphia Inquirer for a while. Since leaving the Inquirer, he's been with the Washington Times, where he's covered 3 White House administrations, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden, and spent a number of years covering the United States Congress as their lead congressional correspondent. So the idea basically is we have disorder in DC right now. So we have an insider who's covering it to tell us a little bit about, you know, the chaos and the drama that's going on today as we speak on the floor of Congress, and generally what might be in store for us with this divided government that the American voters decided that they wanted to have in the last election. So Dave will be with us. He's also, you know, he's covered 3 presidential campaigns, so he can tell you a little bit about what it's like to be one of the boys on the bus back when they were mostly boys, which is no longer true. So Dave Boyer, 7 p.m. Wednesday, January 18th. We'll send out a note tomorrow that'll give you the link to sign up. It'll be like this. Send us sign up on Eventbrite, and we'll send you the Zoom link, and you can just join in. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you so much once again, Marty Moss-Coane, for being with us tonight. Good night, everybody.
Night.